Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the day after of the election of 2024. It's great to see you as we follow up here just one more day with a little bit more reflection, reporting, and also the attempt to answer some lingering questions that undoubtedly have come up over the last several days, whether about the political process or what we're seeing or some of the takeaways or what's ahead. Certainly, this is a time where there's a lot of curiosities about the future and also some reflection, too, of what has transpired up until this point to get to this intersection in the story. I'm going to go ahead as we're live here and welcome on our friends on Instagram, pull them on as we're broadcasting live across all these different platforms, YouTube, X, and as well Instagram. It's great to be able to reach so many different people, and I want to be wherever is most convenient for you. So some people find Instagram really convenient, some find being on YouTube more convenient, and obviously whatever way we can connect is how we would like to do it for you. So one of the things I want to show you today, this is interesting, is there's been so many different reflections of or I don't even know if reflections is the right word. There's been a there's been just some questions about, well, what did we see and why? And a lot of those questions, when it comes to now having President-elect Trump, and we have Vice President Harris conceding just yesterday. So that's some developments over the last 24 hours. I'm going to also show you what President Biden just said as well, because he just spoke to the nation. So now we have these different kind of puzzle pieces coming together. This is a tradition of events that we've seen, a sequence of events across um, across different areas. So whether it's what we expect from a campaign or someone that's sitting in office or currently the president in the White House. So this is sort of a tradition. We have the president elect make a speech. Even if the other one hasn't conceded, that can happen. That's what happened on election night. Then we had Vice President Harris provide a concession speech, and now we have President Biden speaking today. What's interesting about the coverage here in the New York Times, it continues to display the electoral map as we're still waiting for a few final results from some swing states. I thought this headline was very interesting and a good way also to frame our conversation. If the last 24, 36 hours have been a reflection of what does the Democratic Party need to learn or think about the results, now the New York Times is framing it: in Trump's win, GOP sees signs of a new coalition. And the question we can take from that is, well, what are the lessons here really for the Republican Party, if any? And is there any lesson here for political parties? Or is the lesson actually bigger than that? That's what I would like to ask you today. Is this really about lessons learned by Democrats and Republicans, or is this vote a vote for something different in America? And we can kind of get into that. And the reason why I would even ask that question is clearly President-elect Trump is not a typical Republican. He's never been. In fact, there were so many factions inside the party when he was in office for 4 years. And those factions have continued. You have high profile Republicans, Liz Cheney obviously comes to mind, who has stepped away, turned away from him specifically, but also from the broader Republican Party. So are we in a place where, for those of you who have been wondering, could we ever get to a spot where we don't have two parties, but maybe we have four, five, six parties? Could we have strong political organizations in America? I know that hasn't been the case. But our founders didn't imagine a country. They didn't want to imagine a country where there just were these strong political parties. They were thinking about something different. They were thinking about states and how the states could have their own rights within the structure of the United States of America. It's something that's always really fascinated me about the political process overall. It comes from a conversation I had on Ellis Island with the historian there so many years ago. By the way, I will always think about this interview because the first interview I did was in the historical library within Ellis Island. And the historian was amazing. We sat there for like an hour. I just started Smarter News. There's a huge skylight, above you, and you're just sitting in history. It's just amazing. And when I stopped recording, I got the pinwheel of death and lost the entire interview. And I'll never forget that. It wasn't a total loss because I learned a lot in that conversation. And Barry Moreno, the historian at the time, did the interview again, but I'll I'll never forget it. But one of the things we were talking about, and this is how I'm going to pull this all together. We were talking about immigration, and he was saying, it's very difficult for us to understand immigration policies right now because we're thinking about it within the federal government as it stands. But 100 years ago, even the federal government wasn't as big and powerful as it is. And states had their own way of looking at immigration. And here's how the transition happened. And, I never really thought about it because I was always thinking about immigration policy, economic policy within the framework we have now, not thinking about how would I think about those issues differently if I thought about them as a Californian or a New Yorker. How would my worldview about these policies change if really my state could have a more heavy hand in how to run them? And when you start thinking about that, you realize, oh man, we've really evolved. And so the question of where we go next, I think, is a really valid one. It doesn't feel like change can happen dramatically to have 4 or 5 or 6 powerful political parties or states rise again and become more powerful. But we could be in the midst of something much bigger than we could even imagine. And that's what makes these times particularly interesting. Let me go ahead and pull in Mary Katharine Ham here, who's standing by. And I'm curious how many hours she has slept in the last days. Mary Katharine, by the way, is a writer, political commentator. I feel like there's so many different titles, Mary Katharine. Like, what do you think is the one that best describes what you do? How a podcaster? I mean, host?
Yeah, I mean, my husband calls me a professional chit chatter, and I want to be mad at him, but it's actually correct. And I'm happy to do it. It's a great job. I'm happy to talk to all of you and to anyone who's willing to listen. I think my job these days is basically like, the news cycle's out of control. You guys are really busy. Let me take in a bunch of information and kind of distill it, which I think is like sort of related to what you're doing, Jenna.
Yes, exactly. I think that's we all saw a pain point, right? Which is there's the issue is not more content. We have plenty of content. The issue is, what is it all saying? And I don't have time for all of it.
Yes.
And for me, I was thinking, well, how do I get to the audience and give them a trustworthy place for information? Because that was the other stressor, a stress point for so many, which is, okay, even if I have time and even if I like one media outlet, then I don't have time to diagnose whether or not they're giving me it straight or it's too conservative or it's too liberal. And one of the things I found out for women in particular, no shade to the men in our lives that we love and who are a part of Smarter News, by the way. We know you're out there. We love you. Women actually want to read in about something before they share their opinion.
Yes.
That's something that doesn't always happen with a bunch of men. I'm just saying, I'm just going to put it out there. Like they just, feel like they could just jump in no matter what. So anyways, that was part of the motivation for Smarter News. But I'm curious what you think about this. We were just talking about, and obviously the news cycle is going to have a lot of different iterations in the next several weeks and quite frankly, months. And by the way, there could be a huge news story that changes all of this. But in the last several hours after the election results have been called, it's all been about the Democrats. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. What does the Democratic Party take away from this? What are some of the messaging of it? What actually happened? But that equally could be asked of the Republicans too. And I wonder if we can ask it in the same way, because the Republican Party is not a monolith. President-elect Trump is one of the reasons why it's not anymore. You have Republicans that do not like him and have started whole media empires and different political groups, but not become Democrats. So like, what happens in this space? So that's a big question. Like what's kind of some of your key takeaways as you think about, the last 36, 48 hours about the overall political landscape in America?
I think one of the big driving factors here was that Biden, I think convincingly in 2020, obviously given the victory, pitched a promise to return to normalcy in a time when everybody felt like, oh my gosh, what is happening in the COVID era? But he did not deliver on that promise. Things felt chaotic in many ways, whether it was your pocketbook, whether it was the grocery store, whether it was the immigration storyline and the border, whether it was large cities or crime. These things touched people's everyday lives and did not feel like what he promised. And I think, weirdly enough, Trump and the Republican Party were at an advantage because they were not in power for these past 4 years. So he could argue, A, I've been the president. You've seen me do it before. It went okay for your family. And B, I'm not responsible for this stuff. But the question becomes, when you hire a guy like Donald Trump to deliver normalcy, he's certainly an unconventional political figure. How does he do that? And how does the Republican Party do that? Inflation is a sort of intractable problem. Once it goes up, it's very hard to get prices back down. You can bring the rate of inflation down, which is what the Biden administration argues that they did. But people go, I don't know, man. My butter is $6, so that's not enough for me. But that problem will remain. And I think that Trump holds less responsibility for creating the original problem, although not none, because they all spend so much money. But he has less responsibility, but people will hold him responsible as we move forward, perhaps with a little bit more grace than Biden had at this point. So I think the issue becomes, how do you deliver on what you said you were going to do?
And there was all sorts of questions about that. In fact, we got some from our audience as well about, how likely, this is from Britt, how likely is it that Trump is going to do everything he claimed?
Yeah.
And that is the $1 million question for anyone that's elected president. But it's an interesting one, because not just because of some of the goals that President-elect Trump has mapped out, but because of the description of him by his critics, some of them Republican and some of them Democrat, which sets up even more of, okay, it's not just a policy. Is he going to help the economy? Is he the authoritarian leader that I've also been told he's going to be? So how would that's a really big question. Number one, what can he actually do? And number two, of all the things that he talked about, what do you think he should prioritize?
Yeah, I think the people's everyday life is going to be the number one thing to prioritize. Now that means, just to get into this is a little wonky, apologies, but the 2017 tax reform bill that was Trump's, despite reporting at the time and often since, most have conceded, even the New York Times had to say, okay, everyone actually did get a tax cut for the most part during that 2017 package, that many parts of that expire in January 2025. So if they do not address that in some sort of bipartisan way, then people's taxes will go up, just because the time will run out. So that's number one priority. And if you can make something of that and look as if you are working in a bipartisan normal fashion, I think that would go pretty well for you. On the question of what he can, well, let me say this. On the question of how concerned are we about the end of democracy? It's an interesting stat from the exit polls that, in fact, people who were most concerned about the end of democracy, Trump won them. So there are different ways of looking at the threats to democracy, which is something I try to explain to my left-leaning counterparts on TV often, which is hey, a lot of people see some of the things you guys do as a threat to their way of life or a threat to democracy. And it takes them some time to get there with me, but I work on explaining that to them. But this is a real thing that voters feel. Second, I would say I get worried about people, and I have compassion for people who are very sad and very scared about this election result. And I understand that, given that I live in some of the quarters where people, I think, exaggerate the threat to them, right? And I think that there's a lot of fame and prominence to be had from making things as dire as and clicks as dire as they possibly can be. So I would just caution against that part of it, whether it's coming from the right or whether it's coming from the left, because you can make yourself more scared than you need to be. I think that was true during COVID. I think that's true now. Then on the issue of what he can actually do, let's talk about a big one for me, which is tariffs, which is not a thing that I agree with. I'm an economic conservative. I think it could be very dangerous for prices for everyone and backfire, because he offered to bring, to be a person who's going to bring economic sanity. Let me tell you a quick story about his use of tariffs in the past, just to give you an idea of where this might go. He called Emmanuel Macron one time, who's the president of France, who had threatened to put some sort of huge tax on American goods. And he called him on the phone, and this is all reported by normal news sources. And he says, Emmanuel, I'm putting 20% on every champagne and wine that comes into this country if you do this to us. It was some tech thing that Macron wanted to do. And Macron immediately was like, you know what? Never mind that tech tax that I was thinking about doing. So
Right.
that's an interesting way to look at Trump, is that often these are negotiating tactics, and not all of them are policies. However, he's pretty dedicated to the idea of tariffs. So,
It's interesting you say that, though. The Art of the Deal. I read that book when he was running for president, but just realizing that I knew a lot about the kind of the headline, uh,
yeah,
President Trump, but I didn't really know that much about his story. So I thought I'd start there. And it's interesting that you say that because, when he's talking about policies or talking about things, I'm taking him as a kind of quote unquote normal politician who wants to talk about these policies. I'm not thinking about it as he's setting up the second or third conversation he wants to have. And maybe we're giving him too much credit
right.
for that. Maybe there's not that thinking. But one of the things you do see in his conversations, we talked a little bit about this in his longer conversation with Joe Rogan, is that when you see him talk about how he approaches the economy
Right.
and the world, it's from a place of a real estate developer, someone that's very comfortable with debt because you have to be, because you're moving around a lot of money. You're taking loans, you're taking a loan against this to get something like there. And then you're going to get there and you're going to take it from this. And you're like, where's the money? How much is anything worth? But you're comfortable with it as well. Obviously the banking system can also work in your favor.
Right.
And thinking about him in that approach versus someone that's a political animal, that's, at the age of 20 was a political organizer and then went into politics that way. That's a totally different personality, but it's easy to think about all politicians like that and not think about, oh, well, maybe they're actually using the term that the guy across the aisle is thinking of, but thinking about executing it in a completely different way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of Trump supporters view him as a negotiator on their behalf. So they're very comfortable with that. And some of that I think works very well for the country sometimes, in the case of like an Emmanuel Macron who just gets told you can't do that. I would also say he's in this odd position where he is both elected for change and elected for normalcy, right? So people didn't like the last 4 years, but I think it's because the last 4 years felt weird, right? There were things that were really bothering people. And some of those were cultural. Some of those were, frankly, I think some of the school closures finally got a little bit of a comeuppance that hadn't existed before. Just these like large points of upheaval in American society that no one had really answered for, and that people were still upset about. So there's that. But I do think part of the reason that people vote for Trump is because he's an outsider. And who did he surround himself with? I think we've talked about this. He surrounded himself with Elon Musk, right? And he shouted him out in his victory speech. And the significance, I think, of that is that he's pointing out Elon Musk, even though, by the way, Elon Musk totally has the ability to upstage Donald Trump as a sort of businessman figure. And yet he keeps him around. And what he celebrates is the innovation, is his ability to think differently. Then there's Joe Rogan. Dana White. Why are these guys around? Well, Joe Rogan first, I think, represents a curiosity and an ability to like just chat it up, which you saw for 3 hours if you listened to that podcast. He's also somebody who Trump, I'm sure, views as being persecuted by the mainstream in a similar way that he has been, because a lot of people in 2022 wanted Joe Rogan off the air because he was thinking bad thoughts about COVID that he wasn't allowed to say out loud, right? And that's something that people react to, and they want individuals, they want innovative thinkers surrounding this guy. RFK, another example, right? And I find him of various levels of responsibility or reliability on different points, right? But he embodies a distrust of public health and the way that people think about these issues that a lot of people are animated by, right? Another outside thinker. And then Dana White, I would just say, is like a dude's dude, right? Like when you have him around. Go ahead.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I actually have a soundbite I want to play for you and for all of our audience. So one of the questions we got from A. Hallenberg was, is there any hope in the mainstream media for taking accountability for divisional propaganda? And I was like, oof, good question. Yeah. And there's a lot of reflection about the media by the Democratic Party right now about what it looks like. And it actually surprised me. So I was listening to Pod Save America this morning. That is a a podcast that is a political podcast that's hosted by a whole bunch of former Obama administration officials, speechwriter, political activists, pollsters. Like, I actually find it really fascinating. I find them hilarious, likable, and it always provides a little insight into some of the concerns or thoughts within the Democratic Party, even though they're not the ones running the campaigns. For example, back in January, they were already talking about the concern about President Biden's age and saying like the party wasn't addressing it. So they have a way of, and I just want to give them a shout out because I really appreciate them as a resource, to be able to see like, okay, what are people really talking about here? So I was listening to them this morning and they were reflecting on, why did this happen to them? Oh, where are these balloons coming from? Are you seeing them? I don't
have good vibes. That's all. Just good vibes.
I love that. For those of you who could be listening on podcast later, there's just like balloons floating around Mary Catherine's head, which I don't know what that means, but I like it. So we're just gonna let it go. Anyhow, they're having all these different reflections about what was going on and what happened, and there were some moments of, is it the party? But there were a lot of moments that was about the communication and about the media. And I want everyone to listen to how they're talking about Dana White. So for those of you who don't know who Dana White is, he developed the UFC, the Ultimate Fighter or Fighting Championship. Is a fighter championship. So this is a mixed martial arts league, essentially. And at one point, it was considered too violent for television, although that is debatable. And I think there were some new rules that came in. Basically, it's mixed martial arts. So it's boxing, but it's also jiu-jitsu, kickboxing. And it's evolved to become an extremely popular sport, especially after the pandemic, because when all sports were canceled, UFC was held. And they went to all these things, by the way. They would put these fighters on like an island and they had to stay there in quarantine in order to fight. But it also brought new people to the league. Fights can go from 1 minute to 25 minutes. So they're short. There's storytelling behind the fighters. And the reason why I'm telling you this is that if you haven't seen it, I think it's important to understand the context for it. ESPN ended up buying the league, right, for several billions of dollars. It's very successful internationally. So just know that this is a successful international businessman with a huge fan base. So I just want you to listen to, that's just a fact. It's not like, yay, UFC. This is something that if you're not into sports, this has happened. It might have happened without you noticing. So here's how this group talks about Dana White, and is talking about the communication that the Democratic Party has done. Let me go ahead and pull this up.
In Trump's bizarre, rambling speech last night, Dana White gets up there because why wouldn't the head of the UFC speak at the presidential acceptance speech, and talks about all the podcasts that Trump went on, the Nelk Boys, Aiden Ross, all these people. I'm not saying we should do all those things. This is not about Rogan, but we are not, on a day-to-day basis, we are not reaching voters or a certain set of voters organically. And we should spend a lot of time trying to figure out why that is and what we can do about it.
Yeah, to Dan's point, my primary concern is just how we're able to take back the mantle of being the party for the working class, because I'm worried that we've lost it. And the Democrats too often talk about politics as like an intellectual exercise and not a thing that impacts people. But to your point about, Dana White's speech last night, I do think sometimes Democrats view campaigns and elections as like a math problem where you stitch together coalitions and field and policy and then you win. And like Trump did some of that, right? Like no tax on tips was like a discreet, savvy thing to reach an audience. And we know it was smart because Kamala Harris then stole the idea. But I think big picture, Trump views politics as an exercise in dominating the narrative at all times. And he's found a savvy way to do that creates no friction for him, which is constantly talking to these right-wing influencers, podcasts, YouTube stars, whatever they may be. And there was a lot of conversation about like Joe Rogan or no Joe Rogan. I think that's a little bit secondary to the fact that he is doing constant care and feeding to shows that people who are listening have probably never heard of, like Dan Bongino or PPD or like whatever these shows are called, but they have big audiences. They keep his base motivated and fired up. Fox News is the elephant in the room here, but he helps them over time build out a massive, powerful right-wing media ecosystem that the Democratic Party just does not have. Like we run our stuff through the mainstream media, traditional filter. We're getting better at, kind of talking to influencers, Instagram Live, YouTube's, sports podcasts, et cetera. But Trump basically only did that and managed to reach the people he needed to reach. So we need to think about communications in a new way.
So many things here. I just want to point out, I'm laughing just simply because the podcasts that they're mentioning are not just like right wing podcasts. They're some of the biggest podcasts in the entire world. So I just want to point that out. Like, I wouldn't necessarily mean Dan Bongino. He definitely is political, but
some of them are.
I just think it's important to point out that fact. Like,
So
also,
I have so many thoughts about this.
okay, thank you. Please go. Yeah.
Well, Pod Save America is very famous and has a giant audience. And not only that, but has like, I believe, an HBO deal of some kind.
Oh, huge. They've created a huge, by the way, very successful,
Yes.
wide-ranging offering of different podcasts with a bunch of different hosts. They've actually created something really incredible. So just for the record. Yeah.
There's that, right? My friends of the left, let me explain to you why Fox News and this ecosystem exists. Fox News exists because Rupert Murdoch in the 1990s was like, by the way, that's the reason Rush Limbaugh existed too. They're like, seems like there's sure like a missing part in the market of media and news coverage where we could offer something that speaks to people who are not in the broadcast news mainstream media bubble, people who are not center left or liberal, people who like, I don't know, a lot of this country are center right or conservative, and we could speak to some of their issues and we could cover news for them. We would be sort of the anti-NPR, the anti-New York Times, right? There's just be a different vibe. That is successful because there was a gap in the market because everyone was left. And you watch these panels on cable news try to grapple, with few exceptions, try to grapple with what happened. And there's not one person on those panels, with the exception of CNN's Scott Jennings, who does a great job, usually not one person there who can explain why people voted for Trump, because none of them did and none of their friends did. Okay. So there's a gap in the market. There's also a gap in the market, I think, for curious thinkers. Joe Rogan is not a conservative. Joe Rogan was, in fact, a Bernie Sanders voter at one point and a Bernie Sanders supporter. But he is a person who wants to ask a bunch of questions that the people on those panels have said you're not allowed to ask. And this is one of the things about the weirdness that I refer to of the last 4 years. I think it's been animated sometimes on the left by a lot of over-the-top emotion versus like, let's calm down and evaluate what's happening here, coupled with a desire to police other people's speech. That's how you get Joe Rogan being the most popular podcaster in the United States of America.
And let me just interject here, because again, there's probably some people definitely that are listening to us that haven't listened to Joe Rogan. I'm not a normal everyday listener of Joe Rogan, but I have listened to several of his bigger interviews, and especially during the pandemic when he was doing those longer conversations with doctors who were skeptical of the vaccine and had longer conversations on some of these topics just because it wasn't happening in other spheres. I absolutely listen, but there's a lot that I don't listen to because it's comedians, or like I was listening to what recently I thought, oh, this will be an interesting conversation with another podcast doctor that I like, PhD, Andrew Huberman. And like the first 20 minutes they were talking about like wolves and dogs. And I was like, I can't do this. This is not, you know? And it just shows though in the way that what I took away from some of this, again, commentary about the media from this inside Democrat group is I'm like, oh, they still haven't listened to Joe Rogan, because it's easy just to dismiss. Oh, they haven't listened to him at all. Because if they did, they would know. Then he had this conversation with John Fetterman, right? And he's kind of just having all these random conversations. It's actually not an assault on anyone. And the other thing is, if he knew anything,
he's such a friendly interviewer.
Well, it's not. And that's the other thing. There was a debate about whether or not Vice President Harris should have gone on that and this and that. And like, if you listened to him, I think you would have been more like, oh, maybe she should try it. Big audience. Let's just, because it's not really ever a combative interview, but also the same thing. They did the same thing with Dana White. Like, clearly they're not UFC fans. Got it. I understand that. But like, to talk about him in a way that is so patronizing, and I don't have a dog in this race, but I was like, this is the sign of there's not a curiosity about these other places, because you'd have to take some time out to listen for a couple hours.
And the fact is that similar stories, right? Dana White during COVID did the thing you're not supposed to do. he played sports. He had his league play sports. And as a result, because there was a vacuum and no one else was doing that, he got a lot more fans and a lot more successful, right? Joe Rogan filled a gap in the market for long form, interesting, winding interviews with people who say interesting things, and sometimes things that what's the commonality? The overarching Pod Save America broadcast network, cable network people don't want you doing. And it turns out that people want to tune in for those things that they tell us we shouldn't be doing. And if you bubble yourself with the people who are policing the rest of us, you don't see what people care about.
Yeah, so Amy on Instagram saying hearing candidates candidly talking through their views was so beneficial. Constantly seeing Harris avoid having conversations raise more questions and concerns. So that's one point of view. So, they seemed in this conversation to say it's not just a Rogan thing. That's not why we lost. But there were plenty. I mean, I listened to quite a few other the interviews that Vice President Harris did across a lot of very popular podcasters. So it wasn't like she didn't do that. The other thing that I noticed from the conversations, and I want to talk a little bit about the Democratic Party and then go back to the Republican Party too. There seems to be in this, again, just looking at this one podcast and one source of information, a consensus that started on election night that Vice President Harris ran a really good campaign, was extremely disciplined. But really the problem here is President Biden. And that was going to be insurmountable for anyone. Right. What do you think about that? Is it as the fingers are starting to now see what's going to happen, guys, is there's going to be like this kind of lovely, wonderful conversations that are going to take place. And then next week, people are going to get real bitter and then they're going to get angry. Yeah. It's going to be nasty. But it's starting to turn towards that of like, well, it's President Biden was just too old and he didn't do enough on inflation. So that's really why we lost. And those are the only two reasons. And I wonder about the wisdom of that too.
Look, I don't think those are the only reasons, but I think Democrats did put themselves, this is the thing, it wasn't just Biden. The Democratic Party put itself in a real pickle that it couldn't get itself out of. And that began in 2023, possibly sooner. We'll find out when the tell-all book comes out, when it became obvious that Biden probably wasn't up to doing this job. He was 80, for goodness sakes. So there's reason to ask this question. He had sort of suggested he would be a bridge candidate and not run again, but they hadn't really nailed that down. And I would say the party should have nailed that down. So they ignored the fact and they sort of let it ride. They thought, well, maybe we can, this is my biased way of putting it. I think they thought we can get one past these folks. We can get Biden past the goalie. We'll just put him up there. Trump's very bad. So people won't like him. We'll just put Biden up and it'll be fine. And again, I would like to note, this is one of the things you weren't supposed to talk about. I'm sure there are podcasts where Joe Rogan talks about this issue and he talks about
Well, you got in trouble. The White House press corps would get in trouble if they asked about, and I'm saying that they would get admonished by the press secretary for asking questions about President Biden's age. So it was swift and it was consistent.
So they roped themselves off from this idea, from having a conversation about it. And in October of 2023, around then, it might have started a little bit sooner, one man, Dean Phillips, a Minnesota Democratic representative, mounted a little primary challenge to Biden. RFK did the same, by the way. There are two people doing this. So there was an opening for media and for the Democratic Party to contemplate this very seriously and to say, do we need to move here? Because we could still have a primary. They decided no, they did not want to do that. And when the June debate happened, and the thing that everyone wasn't supposed to talk about except voters all were talking about came out into the open, they had to do something then. By that time, it was too late to do something really professional. And they had a vice president who, despite her resume, had never really been in tough political races. There was one she ran in California that was close. It was 10 years ago. She ran a primary for president in 2019 and did not even get to Iowa. So there were real questions about just what does this look like if she runs a campaign? So I think that whole situation culminated in this. And I think, again, part of the reason that people did not react to her well is that she wasn't talking a ton. I listened to the JD Vance on Rogan podcast, and I don't usually listen to the whole Rogan podcast. It's very long, but it was very refreshing to hear people talk and not worry that they were going to get canceled and not worry that they were like saying the incorrect terminology for what people are so cowed and so used to being scared to talk about contentious things that it was very refreshing to hear JD Vance in real time talk through some of his thoughts. He's like, I'm not fully informed on that yet, but I would like to talk about how, say, shrooms or MDMA work for veterans who have, depression. This is something that I'm concerned about, that I'd love to hear more about. So I think that that's interesting and human. And you had this weird contrast where Harris, partly because of the short campaign, was like the most disciplined to a real fault candidate, like would not say more than the sentences that she had decided she was going to say. And the most undisciplined candidate in Donald Trump, who says all the sentences, but people are willing to sort of cut him a break because he's entertaining while he's saying them. It's a very strange contrast. And I think for a lot of people, hearing folks talk it out won the day.
That's what Eliza's actually saying on our chat right now, that she really enjoyed listening to JD Vance, just kind of have the time to chat about a whole bunch of different issues. Yeah. Sherry brings up something. She says, yes, this exactly. They treat us like we are stupid about everything. Tired of being looked down on that way. It is very arrogant. And my question to Sherry and to others on this chat is that true across the board? In this case, the Democratic Party is the loser in this election so far. And I say that just because we still don't know how the House of Representatives is going to go. And by the way, the fact that that's still really tight tells us something. It's not really a party vote. There's something else happening here. So my question for Sherry and others, is that how you just feel about politicians in general? You feel that way. The Republicans do the same thing. They do it in a different way. Is it party specific, or is it a political class issue? And that's what President-elect Trump is doing, is harnessing that. And it's not about his necessarily any of his policies, even his personality. It's just the fact that he's not the elite. And someone, we get a lot, well, he's rich. And he said, if you look at President Trump's entire career as a New Yorker for a period of time, there'd be all this talk about President Trump all the time. In New York, because he'd come up on the gossip pages and, he's doing something like he always does. But there was never a real acceptance into elite society in New York. Yep. He's not going to be at the debutante, even if Ivanka deserves to be there for whatever reason, the money, I don't know. Maybe she was a debutante. I'm just saying there wasn't that arms wrapped around him. He's one of us. He's always been that way. Yeah. And so I wonder if there's any messages if the message for the Democratic Party is the same that the Republican Party needs to take. It's all the same. It's out with all of them.
Well, he's also, the generous term is rough around the edges. Maybe crass would be the more accurate term. Yeah. Trump sometimes, right? But that is something that I think, look at the people he surrounded himself with. Elon, RFK, Rogan, White, Tulsi Gabbard is one I forgot to mention. These are all folks who are outsiders. They are all folks who bucked the establishment. JD Vance is another one, actually. JD Vance had the most liberal establishment academia cred as a writer, as a literary star, that almost anyone could hope for. And this is my theory about why he got picked for vice president, by the way, is that he rejected all of it. He rejected all of those people to say, no, I actually changed my mind about Donald Trump. And he had to explain that many, many times, by the way. That's the things I appreciate about the questions he got versus the questions Kamala Harris got. But these are outsiders. And now, yes, they are going to become the literal establishment because they will be part of this group of people running the country. But I think it signals to everybody who's sick of being condescended to that this is a different kind of political leader, and that the Elons of the world sort of delight in the people who condescend to you, making fun of them too. These very rich people are like, yeah, I don't care if these people hate me. I don't care if they think I'm icky. Of course they think I'm icky.
I'm not interested in being right. Yeah. I'm not interested in being a celebrity. It's interesting here, though. I just want to mention this because it's really coming up on our live chat, and I think it's really important as well. So it's not just, so Tracy says, yes, this is fake versus authentic. But there's also, Ashley says it's not just the politicians, but also the news in general. And Tracy says this, yes, it's news more than the politicians. The mainstream media thinks we are stupid, and Fox News wants us all to be angry. So there you see, it's across the board. It's not just like, oh, the liberal media. Peggy says the media and politicians talk to us like we are dumb. I mean, this is exactly why I left traditional news. This is actually why I built Smarter News, because there was a clear move away from listening to the audience to just saying, we're going to give you whatever we think is good for you.
Yeah.
And I could not get behind it. There would be these debates where we would have two people fighting live on television. And the term inside the newsroom is red meat. Give them red meat. Let's have them battle off about something and just get them yelling at each other. And that's going to make good TV. Pretty soon my producers stopped giving me these segments because I asked too many questions about them. Because I was like, what do we really want people to learn here? Is there anything that we're like, are we trying to like really look at both sides? And it would drive me crazy because it's not actually news or reporting. It's something else. So I definitely do. I see that. And I think including the media in this is critical. I want to show you this. Did you see Jimmy Kimmel last night, Mary Catherine? I don't watch television.
I've seen the clip, I think, that you're referring to.
Okay, I'm just going to play this. I don't know if it, just because this is bringing in the media. It's not just about the news, right? It's also about the media in general. And I'm wondering if you guys saw this. And then I want to play a little bit more. Let's see if I can get by with it.
Let me tell you, that was the worst Taco Tuesday of my whole life. We had the choice between a prosecutor and a criminal, and we chose the criminal to be president of the United States. More than half of this country voted for the criminal who's planning to pardon himself for his crimes. I guess this election wasn't rigged. That's weird, though, right? I mean, he said it would be rigged. He said it was being rigged while people were in line voting. Isn't it remarkable that this time the fix wasn't in? Last time the Democrats cheated. This time we chose not to, I guess. I don't know. This time.
I wanted to stop it there. For people that can't sense it, you might feel it. His voice is kind of shaking, and he's emotional. He's looking like he's going to cry. I mean, and I'm not doing that to make fun of him. I'm saying there's also a group of Americans that are extremely afraid of what may happen. And they've been told a variety of different things. Let me go ahead and play this short soundbite from Pod Save America again, and think about the words that are being used here.
For them, then it's not going to work. Then this is the other big challenge I think that the party faces. And I think this is not necessarily just a challenge of our own making, because we are facing, an authoritarian movement in our country. And so when you fight an authoritarian movement, the instinct is to defend democracy. And Dan, you've talked about this too. Like, if we are always in the position of defending democratic institutions that most of the people in this country do not think are working for them, then it's not going to work. Then we're going to be the defenders of a broken system. And Donald Trump and his folks are going to be the ones who are going to, they want to burn it down. We should at least be the party that doesn't want to burn the system down, but wants to fix it and wants to reform it.
Okay, but think about that, the setup, right? We're facing an authoritarian regime. Somebody's going to burn everything down. And this is what people have heard for years. And so I want to not ignore that segment of the American public too.
Right.
Because people feel like Jimmy Kimmel. They're upset and they're worried. But we're all part of the same country. So how do we kind of bring everybody back in the fold? Maybe that's not the question to ask. But some of the word choice, we should ask some questions about.
A couple things. One, I think that I was praying for, I was looking at the data, and it looked like to me that Trump was going to win the presidency. And either way it went, I was hoping for a decisive victory, because it would get us out of the loop where substantial numbers of people, whether I think they're right or not, are not trusting the result of the election. And that's not healthy. We just want to be out of that space. So I think this decisive victory actually helps that very much. So there's that. Two, I think this is cold comfort to my friends of the left. But the fact that the most diverse coalition by class and race ever put together by Republicans, and by location, by the way, urban and rural, went to Donald Trump, is a unifying factor in and of itself. He has cross-seated the parties. He has made this hybrid, which is why many of the old guard Republicans and people, more ideological conservatives like me, are not as comfortable in that coalition. It is more populist, it is more working class, and it uses different forms of communication and policy to reach those folks. But I got news for you. Those folks were Democrats. They're not your enemy, but you did lose them to this coalition. And so I think that's the thing they have to contemplate. And instead of saying the people who left us are evil and authoritarian, you might say, how do I speak to the people who left us? And the same is true of the GOP, by the way, with suburban women who did not turn in the way that Harris hoped they would. And I think that was, again, condescension, one-note abortion messaging, sort of taking them for granted and not dealing with their day-to-day issues. How, for the GOP, the ones you did lose, how do you talk them back into the coalition, right? You don't call them
Martha,
evil for leaving.
Exactly. And I started to cut you off there. You don't call them evil, you were saying. Martha, I wanted to make sure we got her comment in because I think this is so dead on and brings us to another part of the story that sort of comes out of the party politics. She's saying, I still feel like I had no option but Trump or Kamala. The Republican Party didn't give us another option despite wanting another option. And that's something that really came through in our survey at Smarter News, which is there are many people that up until Election Day were like, I still don't really feel compelled to vote for either of them. And there's not an option for who's seeing me out there, because I'm still being forced to make a choice or forced not to vote, which doesn't feel good. Because I just feel like I can't. And I'm summarizing here. The feeling was, I don't want to betray myself, but I also don't want to betray the voting process. So what do I do here? And I'm very curious about those folks, because I wonder, did they go in and not check a box for president? And this is why we're seeing, for example, President Trump and win in certain states, but then a Democrat winning as governor or senator, for example. Like, is that what we're seeing? Or did people make a choice? I don't know.
People definitely were doing some ticket splitting as a desire to sort of protect against what they worried about with Trump. So like, okay, I'm going to vote for him at the top of the ticket maybe, or not vote for Harris, but I'm also going to vote for the opposite party for Senate. That happened. And I love divided government. I think that's great. I would call myself a double disliker who nonetheless voted, right? And part of that is that, look, I lost the argument in the primary. I've tried to have that argument. I think that I think there could be a different kind of candidate that would be better. And I also have to admit that I lost the argument. And when I lost the argument, Donald Trump built the most diverse Republican coalition that has ever existed. And I like that about what he's built. So I need to concede that maybe I didn't know how to do it, and maybe he did. Right? Now, Ron DeSantis has done some of that in Florida. Youngkin has done some of that in Virginia. Kemp has done some of that in Georgia. So there are other people in the mix. But part of democracy is realizing that I lost that argument in the primary and trying to figure out what I can do about it now. So, and I honestly, I do kind of enjoy the rogues gallery of figures that he has put around him. I am interested in what those people think. I am interested in outside thinking and the fact that they have sometimes weird ideas about what could be done, because the federal government is not a place where you get creative thinking. I would also say that voting for me always has been, because I'm a hybrid, and I bet most of you guys are, and an independent thinker. Voting's never been like a perfect fit for me, right? Every single candidate I vote for, I'm like, it's closer to what I want than what I don't, right? And if I like them, great. I think one of Trump's saving graces, by the way, is that he's funny. People like funny. And he smartly, I think, I don't know if he did it on purpose, but with the Rogan interview, the McDonald's thing, the garbage truck and the vest, he hearkened back not to 2016 Donald Trump, who was like maybe a little more serious and angry. He hearkened back to 80s, 90s Donald Trump, cameo Donald Trump. Yes. People aren't mad at cameo Donald Trump in Home Alone 2. They like him. So I think that likability factor, which I think was very challenging for her, and I don't mean that in a gendered way, I just think she was not engaging with people, So apologies to the ladies. I don't mean that ladies can't be likable. Sometimes.
Yeah, is that what you're saying? You're saying women aren't funny. That's going to be the headline to our podcast. And Mary Catherine Hand says women are not funny. And
I
this
do
is why
not
we lose
believe that, and I
elections.
do not embody that. I do not accept that as my truth. But sometimes people say that and kind of mean it as shorthand, and I didn't mean it that way. I just mean she was not engaging with people in those same ways at all. So I think that's his saving grace sometimes, and it gets people to his side when they don't agree with him on a lot of things. They're like, I don't know, the McDonald's guy doesn't seem like Hitler to me.
Yeah. Good point. Good point. I didn't even get into some of that commentary, which is something that the Democratic Party really invested heavily in the final days. Fascism, Adolf Hitler, Nazi rallies. I mean, they went in the paint for it. It's interesting though. This is a great example. So Caitlin's saying, "I love double dislikers." Such a great term because the term is double haters that people have used. But this is a great example. I've used. So the Washington Post had a big piece about double haters that I've referenced when President Biden was in the race. And so that's kind of a term that's been around. But the audience doesn't, every time I use that term, I have to remind myself and I slip up. The audience doesn't like that term because those that are quote unquote double haters don't think that they're hating on people and they don't like being called that. And it's a great example of but the media keeps calling them that, but they're like, that's not me. Yeah. Call me a double disliker. Call me disenfranchised. Call me that I'm not inspired, but I'm not a double hater. And they're not listening. I'm even not listening, which by the way, I really do. That's an accident. It's not on purpose. But I think it's even in just some of the terms that we're using, people just don't feel represented. And yet that we're still using the same language over and over again. And it's an example of how things just kind of don't change. So then the question is how do they change? Is this going to be an election where the Republican Party and the Democratic Party say, okay, listen, I can't look at Hispanic voters or suburban white women or Black men in urban areas in the way that I've been looking at them for decades. Do you think this actually honestly changes people, Mary Catherine? Or do you think the industry of politics in America is just too big, that there's been a structure built around it that, these pollsters or these analysts would have to just burn it all down because they would lose everything, their livelihood, their reputation, if they actually do that. So the structure kind of keeps on going without anyone realizing that's not working.
I think there's some of that in the federal government, but I don't think that exists in politics, as illustrated by the fact that Donald Trump, flanked by Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, and Dana White and Tulsi Gabbard, is becoming the establishment, right? You can change the game. I think he did in 2016. He also spent far less money than Kamala Harris did. He spent almost no money in 2016. He doesn't have the same kind of ground game that politicians have used for years, and yet he gets millions of people out to vote for him. He makes many people question everything they know about how electoral politics works. And I do want to say they had a much more professional ground game this time around. I don't mean to insult that, but it is not like what the Democrats do that everyone assumed must happen. I also just want to, I call myself a double disliker because I don't like the idea that I hate either of these people. I'm not hating them. So that's where that comes from.
They love it. So you should copyright it. So that would be good.
Also, shout out to the freedom not to vote. That's one of the things, I don't always vote for every race, and that's because someone has to earn your vote. It's okay for you to dislike both of them and say you didn't earn my vote. They have to come and talk to you. That's the beauty of the system. And one of the things I love about the Electoral College is that every 4 years, everyone goes what's the point of you people who don't know what's going to happen in this election? And I'm the point of me is to what I said before, digest things that you don't have time to digest and to think about them. And yet sometimes to put my predictions out there, but it is so wonderful that tens of thousands of people in 7 states who I don't know what they're going to do get to decide. And we don't know which tens of thousands of people in which 7 states those will be. It's a whole different game every time. It's so great. So I love
freedom.
I love
Bethany was saying this on Instagram. She said, I was surprised how many people were so confident in a candidate that they were willing to put a sign in their yard. I'm never that 100%. I totally relate to that. Because I'll tell you this story real quick. Are you short on time, Mary Catherine? Do you need to leave?
Good.
I know you're good. So there was we were at I was at it was a post football flag football for my son party this weekend, and not a party. There's like a local distillery. Everyone goes there with their kids afterwards, and you can get food and hang out. And there was this super cute mom that runs her own business, and her daughter had played with my daughter, and we just bumped into each other. And
Right.
she's wearing a "Make America Great" hat, and I was like, oh, like. Because she just never, I mean, she wasn't on the sidelines with it. She didn't have the flag in her car. Like, I was like, oh, I said, hey, I'm just curious. Because she mentioned Tomorrow News. And I said, well, let me do a little reporting. Like, what's the reaction to your hat? Because we live in an area where there's conservatives and there's liberals and they're all together. And there's a really strong libertarian stream, which I think most political parties totally ignore. That's a different conversation. She's like, actually, like, she's like, nothing. Most people are just like, give me a thumbs up or not. And she said, a couple years ago, I wouldn't wear this, but now I don't care. She's like, because I'm really worried about the economy. She said she's worried about her business. But to wear the hat and walk out the door is something different than saying, hey, I'm going to vote for Trump. It's a different posture. And I thought that I looked at that and I was like, is that an indicator? Is that an indicator of what's to come? She's the suburban woman, that everyone's looking at. And she feels confident now in a different way that she didn't feel before. So I thought that was interesting.
So I am sometimes jealous of people who are like really on board. And I'm like, I would like be excited to be that excited about a candidate. And I have at times. Like, I really liked Paul Ryan, who was the vice presidential candidate for Mitt Romney on that ticket. I liked a lot of his ideas and the idea of like actually dealing with entitlement spending, which is that ship has sailed, everyone.
So unpopular. Yes.
Right. So I'm the weirdo. I understand that. I also really liked Governor Youngkin in Virginia, who's done a great job and was very forward thinking on the open schools argument and very kind to parents when they had been really beat down for a while by our leaders. So I like him. But I don't get that feeling super often. And I like that people have it. And I don't want to rain on their parades. I also think that many people of the right, certainly in more blue and moderate areas, feel that liberals get to wear their allegiances on their sleeves, but they feel much less comfortable doing so. And one of the things that really animated me, and I'm not putting just general liberals in this category, but one thing that animated me during this cycle is when to be more open about what I was thinking and to applaud other people is when someone tried to kill Donald Trump as a free person. It made me very angry to have someone try to take him off the board as one of my free people choices. And it made me want to be more bold. And I wonder if that happened to a lot of people. That may not be related, but that's something that I was like, I live in a free country. Do not do that to my candidates. And I would have felt the same way about Kamala Harris. So I think
100%.
some people maybe embraced that a little bit more. I will also say in the blue and moderate areas in which I live, I was seeing a shy suburban women voter for Trump. I was not seeing a shy Kamala Harris voter. I was unconvinced that existed, even though they were telling me it might. And I saw it everywhere with suburban women in blue areas. And I think you saw it loud and clear on the maps.
What was that about? What did the women that suddenly felt compelled to vote for President-elect Trump feeling?
It was a focus on their day-to-day life. I think, okay, let's do Loudoun County. Can we talk about Loudoun County real quick? And I don't know the final numbers. Loudoun County, Virginia is and I'm going to use.
Oh, Loudoun County. Sorry. I thought you said loud and counting. I'm like, is that a game?
No.
Is that a political game?
County. It is
Loudoun County. Okay.
Extremely affluent, extremely large population. And I apologize for using this moniker for us because, not all of us are, it's probably not the most friendly one, but it's peak wine mom. Like, we are Stanley Cups. We are going to soccer games. We are.
Sounds like a fun bunch here.
I know.
We're curious. We're more curious. Yes.
So, and I don't live in Loudoun County, but I live near it. It is like definitely blue. A lot of government workers, quite liberal. Biden won that county by 25 points. And in this election, there was at least a 10-point swing away from Democrats. Now, that doesn't mean Harris didn't win the county. But when I saw those numbers come in, I was like, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm seeing in my everyday life, where there are people who are quietly voting the other way because they probably think that their book club's going to kick them out if they say
Okay.
Yeah.
This is what I'm seeing from Instagram. So Mrs. Naomi Hunt says, totally, voting left has become the acceptable moral good, and to support Trump is so vilified. It makes me angry. Annie says, I struggle with signs and jerseys, mostly because I feel like I'm condoning the whole person. I wanted to have a sign, but I didn't because I don't want people to think I like everything about Trump. We have a lot of women that are saying, oh, here's one. I ordered a denim Make America Healthy Again hat, and I can't wait for it to come in. Informed choices and better food should be bipartisan.
This is
and I think this is, I was just going to say, I think this is one of the most underreported stories. And I think it's because the press, the mainstream press, and I don't love using that term, but traditional media has already decided that they were not going to talk to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. because of what's going on with vaccines. And that the vaccine part of him and what he's talked about is one part. The part about food, because a lot of people could feel a lot of different things about vaccines. There are very few people that are like, you know what? I'd like more artificial coloring in my food. I'd like more, no, that's an issue that a lot of families really care about. And from based again on our survey and Smarter News, this was a really big deal for certain voters that were on the fence and thinking, I would like to give that a try. I'm concerned about our health more than anything else. Y'all can keep fighting about whatever you want to fight about, but Make America Healthy Again is something that I feel really passionate about. And that was a voter that has not been talked about almost at all in some of the coverage I've seen.
This is another thing I saw, right? Is I think a lot of women, particularly this Loudoun County type of community, lost trust in a lot of public figures, lost trust in a lot of public health. If you were sending a child, and I'm not going to go get crosswise with anyone on masks, but if you were sending a toddler to preschool in masks, which you were in a lot of blue areas of the country, and you thought, this doesn't make a lot of sense, guys, I don't think we're doing the right thing, and you dared to speak about that, you were vilified. I have a friend who was an open schools mom who, in public, the superintendent to her was like, I mean, I know you just want to go back to yoga and brunches, but we're not your babysitters, like that kind of thing, right? Another Alexandria school board member said, like, well, do you want your kids educated or dead? To the public. So the way that people were treated made them distrust these people with very good reason. Loudoun County was the center, by the way, of some very pitched gender fights, some issues with sexual assaults in schools that were covered up. Things made them distrust for a reason. And the left is far too engaged in excluding voices because there's one thing I don't like that you said. Right? Rogan, you can't be a voice. You need to be off Spotify because you said things we don't like about ivermectin. Right? I mean, and RFK can't say anything. You can't be in public because you don't believe all the things that we believe. And then they leave on the table the idea of processed foods, which makes a lot of moms really mad.
Yeah. It does, right? It's so Stephanie's weighing in on Instagram. She said, I have a conversation with the moms today about Trump. We both voted for him, and I was looking around to make sure no one was giving me dirty looks. That's still that environment that you're talking about. And I wonder, in the next election cycle, can we feel free? Can we feel liberty enough where we can have these conversations and we don't feel that way? Because whether it was about COVID, whether it was about masking, vaccines, treatments, education, political persuasion, Israel, I mean, name the topic. There have been folks that feel like they can't speak their mind or ask questions. And it kind of comes full circle in our conversation, which is like, if you feel like you can't ask a question in a free society, that does not feel good. Americans are never good. It doesn't matter what political party you're part of. It could be the Republicans next. It's not like they're totally, free of any critique. So it's that though, that feeling of like, you can't actually say what you're going to say because you're going to be punished.
Yeah. I have a joke in my head about like a bunch of women sitting around sipping wine at their bachelorette viewing or their book club. And like, they're all secret. Like one of them's like, she voted for Trump and she like just barely admits it. And she thinks she's going to get like ruined for this. And then another one is like, I did too. And then eventually you realize that every single one of them did. I think there are a couple book clubs like that. I don't think that's out of the...
Well, but that's not the way the Democratic Party was talking to those women. They were telling them that if their husbands were going to vote for President Trump, that they should secretly cast the ballot for Vice President Harris. And I thought that was such an interesting strategy, because when Hillary Clinton said that, oh, she lost because some women decided to vote with their husbands, it was just as patronizing as telling someone to sneak behind your husband's back. I just don't know. And I'd love the women on the board to weigh in here.
Well, this is the
I just
condescension.
don't know many relationships like that where people are sneaking around to like cast a ballot of, I know a lot of relationships where there's different politics in it,
Yes.
but not enough to be like, I'm going to look at a Post-it note in the bathroom stall that's going to tell me to secretly vote one way or the other.
No, I think this is the condescension that comes through in all of this messaging that is not, I don't think people respond to it well. It is like, it seeps into all of the commentary if you're in a bubble and if you're not aware of how to talk to different people. So I think it would be better if next time around people feel more comfortable. I do know, like, even here in Northern Virginia, in places where like you would never expect it, I am seeing at least double the Trump signs that I saw the last election. And I think that's partly because there is this desire to just be like, no, this is who I'm standing for, and it's a free country, and you're not going to mess with me.
Well, okay. So quick final thought here, because one of the things I saw again, listening to Democrats talk over the last couple of days, I just want everyone to understand the stakes and why the conversation is where it is. It's not just that President-elect Trump won all these swing states and is presumed to win the remaining ones where we don't have the official results yet, or unofficial official results yet. Mm-hmm. It's that he also won the popular vote. Yes. It's also looking at these counties where the trend line away from the Democrat Party, that the Democrats may have still won that county, let's say, but the trend line is moving quickly away from them, even in areas where they would believe that they would just kind of always win.
Yeah.
And so for the Democrats, it's a moment of, we got this wrong. And if we don't correct it, we could be seeing Republicans in office for the next several decades. It's that sort of a stakes. That's what the concern is. It's not just, oh man, it's President-elect Trump and we didn't like him. It's, oh, there's something seriously wrong with our strategy. And if we don't figure it out, we're in a much more desperate situation than we thought we were in. It's also that.
Yes, I think that's correct. The Senate also is Republican held, and the House probably will be too. The thing that the Trump campaign did successfully, by the way, reaching those podcasts, and it wasn't just men that they reached, but they told men, sometimes low propensity male voters, many young men, there is a place for you here. There's a place for you here. And I have talked to some left-leaning friends, and I've said to them, like, okay, what is the word in your circles that is most associated with the word masculinity? And the answer is toxic, because that's the buzzword, right? For any left of center person, that is what they associate with masculinity. And I want to give you an interesting stat. It's reputable. It comes from an American Enterprise Institute study of politics and sexuality. Trump was able to reach these men by telling them, like, basically, I don't hate you. I don't think you're toxic. I don't think that you're the problem with everything in this country. And far too much of left-leaning messaging says that to them. Not all of it, but far too much. And the stat is your view of yourself as whether you are very masculine as a man is a partisan divide for men. When men say Republican men say they're very masculine in their own self-view, at 53%. For Democrats, that number is 33%. So there's a real, very clear divide. You know what other two groups identify as very masculine at the same rate as Republican men? Latino men and Black men. So when you turn your back on the idea of masculinity as envisioned by these men, if you don't allow for the idea that there are good men who are very masculine, who are doing their part for America just like everyone else, and I'm being a little reductive of the message. This is more of like the message you get from like college world, academia, but that world leaks out into Democratic politics very frequently. So if they're hearing toxic masculinity from you, they might look elsewhere to, I don't know, a guy who's campaigning with Dana White. Like, that's a fit. That's a bit.
Interesting. That's interesting because we do spend some time speaking about women voters, but that swing voter, which is a young man, which we don't really look at that way. I don't know why. We just decided not to count him.
Well,
But maybe we should.
it's because they don't usually vote. And I will add this as a positive for
Ah.
Trump's win. Having young men engaged in society in this way is very good for everyone, because you do not, any society that sort of has real problems with upheaval and social upheaval and crime and all sorts of things, they often have a large population of young unmarried men who are not engaged with society in healthy ways. And so bringing those guys into the tent when they are suffering sometimes from very serious economic problems, lack of educational attainment on a bunch of fronts, despite all the help women messaging you get, they're the ones who are actually doing worse on many, many metrics. And if you tell them they have no part in this society, that won't go well for us. So I'm glad they're coming in. I'm glad they see themselves represented and that they can be part of the process.
So that brings the stakes to be very high for the Republican Party. And I promise we really will finish here. I know you probably have a million things to do. I just can't help
I have
talking.
one more thing written down that I do want to make a point about. And other than that, I'm good to go.
Well, the only thing I wanted to make sure is to evenly weight this conversation, because if the stakes are high for Democrats, it's also high for Republicans. And if you have young men that feel connected to the political process, now there's a question about deliverables under this new Trump administration.
Yep.
I have to, by the way, I feel like I have to be really careful. And I don't know if it's because of collective trauma from the attempted assassinations of former President Trump. I very much worry about the security and health of all of our politicians.
Yes.
And I feel like although we've kind of moved into a different post-election world, I still feel a tentativeness of, I hope everyone stays safe. Like, I feel very concerned about that. I just feel like I need to just state that for the record. In a new Trump administration, though, there has to be deliverables. What does that look like? Does it look like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. going in and like completely just dismantling the FDA? Is it a kick down the door sort of thing? Is it a way that President-elect Trump does work within the system? Can he go into the Department of Justice and say, hey, there's way too much politics here. We got to go after the bad guys, the enemies, not each other. Here's how we're going to do it, but keep some of the framework. Like, what does it look like? Because that's a concern for people that are nervous about. That's a real concern. And for people that like President-elect Trump, there's a real concern of who's left to work with you. And what is that going to look like? And we've seen you like people for a couple months and then fire them. So what is this new, what's going on here?
Yeah, okay, there's a lot there. So I think that one of the great things and one of the reasons that I like a Youngkin or a DeSantis is because I feel that both of those guys are change agents to a certain degree, but extremely, and outside thinkers, but extremely informed about exactly what their powers are and exactly how to use them. That is not Trump's style, okay? Trump is like, he comes in, he's bull in a china shop. He's like, I'm going to do these things. Now, sometimes he doesn't mean he's going to do those things. And if those promises are not realized, particularly for a young first-time voter, that might disillusion them and send them elsewhere, right? But I think a lot of this will come down to who is advising him, who is thinking through this stuff. I think Elon Musk actually is a person whose brain maybe could wrap around the management of the federal government for a minute to try to figure that out. He's also unorthodox, so who knows? But so it'll come down to like who's advising him, whether those people know what the right levers are to pull, because the federal government is a very, very stubborn animal, very resistant to change. However, there are things you can do with the structure of agencies, with where power comes from within an agency. There are ways that you can sell the changes you're making to the American people so that it makes them happy, and then they're on board with you, which makes it harder for your adversaries to say, no, you can't change anything. I think there's an argument to be made for Trump and for Republicans that this was a change mandate of some kind and to pitch those changes. But here's the cautionary part, and I'll apply it. It'll help me make my final point too. I think when people are in charge, they forget to look at their own authoritarian impulses, right? And that's a thing that worries me about Trump, not to the degree of my, bless their hearts, very emo colleagues sometimes in the media, but it's a thing that worries me. I want people to know the limits of their power and respect them. But So this is one thing I hold myself accountable for is, yeah, I had a preferred candidate. I had a preferred outcome, but I do not prefer for that person to tread all over these ideas and the limits that the Constitution holds them within. And I will talk about that as we go forward. A lot of the media will tell you anytime Trump does something that's different, that it's evil and bad and terrible and it blows up everything, right? And it's like, can we just calm down for a second and figure out what he's doing? Is it unorthodox and allowed? Is it unorthodox, allowed, and popular? Would it work? These are interesting things to talk about, but often they go immediately to emergency.
Right. And orthodox and illegal is something different, or unorthodox and unconstitutional. Then we're in something different. But is it just different? And we haven't thought about it that way. Mm-hmm.
And then the other part of this is that for the media, for the left, they have a real blind spot for their own desire to deviate from norms, to not respect the Constitution. I think a lot of people reacted to the fact that under the Biden administration, one of the things that didn't feel normal was, in fact, in New York, and I know you've talked about the charges against Trump, but it truly was a novel, completely new charge created for Donald Trump in the city of New York for that conviction. And that wasn't a good look for the DOJ, for the Southern District of New York, for Biden, because that looked like using the justice system in the ways you say Trump will against your political enemies. So when you're in charge, you get a little excited and you do the things that you're telling everyone that your opponent's going to do. They don't believe you anymore. And there are other examples, like the college loan one annoyed me, where it's like, the Constitution says you can't do this. The judges say you can't do it. The courts say you can't do this. We're going to do it anyway. So like, or packing the Supreme Court, that one really annoys me. These are things that you can't accuse someone else of doing and then do, and then people trust you. And I think that was part of this too. But a cautionary tale for everyone who's in charge.
Yes. Yeah, we'll be watching, is what we're saying. Yeah. The wine moms, the non-wine moms, the emo colleagues that you mentioned. I loved how you got to bless your heart in there too. Like that was good.
They're hurting, but like sometimes they're hurting because they did it to themselves. Like, whew.
Yeah. Well, it is important to know the limits of one's power. Yes. And it's difficult. I know all of us probably in our various stages of life have been, you get caught between saying, well, I've seen this behavior and I've seen someone say this, and so I believe them, and that's why I'm worried. Or I see someone say this and I'm going to wait to see if they actually do it, because I'm not sure if they're just saying it or if that's a tough thing to know, because you don't want to continue to get hurt by the person that says something wrong, right? And then does it. But then also you have to sometimes reserve judgment to see what exactly is going to happen and how is it going to happen. And I know that's a tough period. Everyone's asking, well, what are the next step? I had a great question about mass deportations. That's a great example. President-elect Trump has talked about that. He's been asked, but never pushed enough by the press and others. Like, what do you mean? How does that actually work? What are you talking about? What are the limitations?
Can I give a quick thought on that for rhetoric?
Yes.
Rhetoric observation. When it comes to immigration, generally, for instance, when a bipartisan bill, they're like, we're going to give you both a path to citizenship and security, right? We're going to do both together, which I don't even think that's a bad philosophy. It's just that in the past, you get the path to citizenship, you get the amnesty, you never see the security. The two don't actually end up happening together. So my thought on border stuff has always been, you have to buy trust for amnesty or path to citizenship or whatever you want to do with security. And so the advertised position is always more than what you end up getting. So I would argue, and I don't know if I'm right, that mass deportations probably means deportations of criminal illegal immigrants who are in the custody of the state. Like, if we could just get that, a lot of people would be happy.
Interesting. I don't think that's not the person that people imagine. They imagine that a child with a young mother, not someone that's actually sitting in a prison in the United States that our taxpayer money is continuing to feed and provide healthcare to, because there's not a great process to get them out of the country, even though they may not have legal status. And those are the things that, again, it's up to the media, it's up for good reporting to say, this is how many people we're talking about that are currently in our prisons, or this is how many people that we don't actually know where they are. And the data has been tough with that. It's a good example too, just to finish on, because in the same way that student loans were approached with executive action by President Biden, there was a border executive action that's been in place for the last several months that's led to fewer encounters at the border, but it's been legally challenged because it's a question of whether or not it oversteps executive power. And so we don't know if it can continue. And it's really not even a partisan issue. It's very specific to this administration. Like, is that legally allowed? Can we change the definition of amnesty in action right now? Can a president do that in an emergency? Is it an emergency? So these are things that come up for every administration. They just have different styles and they get different press coverage. And that's why it also feels different. So
the press coverage part is a large part of it. But yeah, my general sense on the deportation thing is if somebody tells you they're just going to deport criminals, you get no one deported. And if someone says they're deporting everyone, maybe you'll get criminals deported.
I see.
This is something that moved voters in this election. Immigration, I believe, went from second to first in a lot of people's exit poll reported priorities. And it was partly because of this sense that, like, can we just do the easy stuff? Like, we're not even stanching the bleeding here. People are getting hurt. There are criminals who are put in jail, accused criminals put in jail and then released immediately, and then they do other things. It's like, that's the bare minimum from your government. Like, people would like them to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Immigration always does. That's why we cover it on Suburban News every month, even when it doesn't feel especially exciting to cover border numbers, because it always comes back around. It always does. It always becomes an issue. So we want to make sure we follow it. Mary Katharine, thank you. What are you going to do after you don't have to be on television or radio or podcasts for 24 hours at a time? Like, what's life going to look like?
I don't know. I might make myself a meal. It's crazy.
Oh, yeah. Charity. Okay. I told everyone, I tell this quick story. I don't know how many people are with us, but I just want to bring you back. I said this on Instagram earlier. I was like, I'll tell everyone a funny story about us at the beginning of our friendship. Yeah. We had 2 little kids. It was snow day in New York City. Yes. Mary Katharine just was like, I'm going to come over. She was in town to do some work. And our kids were like, probably like 2 and 1, maybe. They were young. We had babies. Yeah. We were babies. Yes. And we were in like the little apartment playroom, and that wasn't really working. And so we decided to go back to my apartment, and Moana was big. So thankful for Moana in so many ways. And we're sitting there, and I was like, what do you want to do? Like, should we order food? And I look in my refrigerator. I don't really have any food. Because I lived in New York, and your refrigerator was like the size of like a shoebox. But I did have some champagne and some orange juice, as one does. So I was like, oh, we'll have mimosas. This will be so great. But then neither of us knew how to open a bottle of champagne.
I'm ashamed.
I hate to admit it. I can't believe it. I had 2 children. I was a national news anchor, and I was like, ooh, I don't know. But I did figure it out. And it was the beginning of many, many champagne bottles opening between us. And I think we're like, do I need to Google? Don't worry, folks. I figured it out. Everything's good. Everything's under control. That. Don't ask me to change your tire. Okay. I don't know how to do that, but
I can do that, but I can't open the champagne bottle. No, I can now. What is that?
What is that?
I somehow made fireworks on my background. Everyone who's listening to audio.
Oh my gosh. I love it.
It's for the champagne. But yeah, I can do the tire. I can now do the champagne, but I wasn't much of a champagne drinker back then. Probably I was more of a beer girl. So I was probably like, it was new to me. And that's just a lesson on how you just have to learn new skills and move forward. And both the Republican and the Democratic Party might have to do that. So
I love that. We're like, listen, everyone can drink what they want to drink. And then sometimes you change. And here you are. Yep. Election 2024. The end. MK, thank you. I appreciate you. You're the best. We should do this more often. Everybody needs to listen. What is your podcast? You have your own podcast. Please tell us all about it so people know where to get it.
I have, in fact, 2 podcasts. One.
Oh, all right. I'm sorry.
One's called Getting Hammered. Everyone who has podcasts, we just collect them. One's called Getting Hammered, which I host with my co-host Vic Mattis of the Washington Free Beacon, who's a great guy who knows a lot about wine and food. So we do mostly politics, but we have some other fun as well. And my friend Carol Markowitz, who is a mom of 3. She lives in Florida. She was one of those women who went from New York to Florida during the pandemic. She's a writer for the New York Post. That one is called Normally. And we just talk about how you do politics normally.
I love that. Okay, well, we'll have to have the both of you on too. That would be fun. We could do like a little Smarter News normally
Carol Straight.
collab.
Yeah.
Collab, as they say, you know, how the young kids, the influencers say. All right, Mary Katharine, I'll call you in a little bit. Thank you so much. You're the best.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you. Okay, bye. It's just she's the best. She's the best. She's the best of the best. I just love her. A couple of things I thought I would just share this one funny comment because it made me laugh, and I hope it makes you laugh as well. Tracy says, my middle school son said that all his friends like Trump, but their parents were voting for Harris. And I said that's because Trump acts like a middle school boy. It made me laugh. And I feel like we're at this point where we just have to be able to laugh at jokes at different people. Like, it's okay. You just laugh. I was like, not bad. Sounds on brand. I don't know. I think everyone's ready for a little laughter and a little relaxation. And I don't know about you, but I was waiting for these different stages, you know, whether it's the end of election day, hopefully getting results. I wasn't sure what the next several weeks were going to look like, because if it looked like there was something that was hotly contested, that would be our coverage for the next, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. And I just didn't know what life was going to look like. And I was getting nervous about that. I didn't realize how many different feelings of anxiety I had about related to politics in America, because my job is to be neutral and I practice that. So I don't really allow that in until I'm able to let it go a little bit. So seeing what we've seen over the last several days, I think was really important. And I want to underscore that. I'm going to leave you with about 30 seconds of President Biden today, because if you missed it, I think it's important to hear his message. But we had President-elect Trump say he won, essentially. Then you had Vice President Harris concede the election. Then you had the President of the United States come out and make a statement. In this time period, you saw people like Jeff Bezos, big executives, as well as leaders like the Prime Minister of India, come out and publicly congratulate President-elect Trump. This is part of the process. It can feel overtly partisan and political, but it's part of the process of an acknowledgement, not only by our community here in the United States, but the international community, which, by the way, was quicker than our own politicians in many cases, in saying congratulations to President-elect Trump. Whatever strategy that is, I'll leave that be. But it was interesting to watch that, because sometimes that would follow our own political process doing it, but it was quick and it was swift. And it was a moment of turning the page. I don't know if we've turned the page completely. I don't even know what that means anymore. It feels like a big continuum of a developing story. But what President Biden said today was important. It was an acknowledgement of President-elect Trump. He said that he spoke with him, but he also said this, and I just want to play this for you again. It's just 30 seconds. Here we go. Why don't we just take a quick listen?
Campaigns are contests of competing. Campaigns are contests of competing visions. The country chooses one or the other. We accept the choice the country made. I've said many times, you can't love your country only when you win. You can't love your neighbor only when you agree. Something that I hope we can do, no matter who you voted for, is see each other not as adversaries, but as fellow Americans.
I thought that was a really nice part of the speech. And there is this moment that happens between elections where there is a breath for reflection and new thinking. It's very easy to fall back into familiar postures because we've been in such a hyped up political environment. But I want to leave you with that sense of hope too, that in this time period of transition, where you have people that are not necessarily vying for their next job because either they've won it or they haven't, that there's a moment to reflect on where our country stands today and where it's going. And that's what I look forward to in the next few weeks. Also, admittedly, I never like early Christmas decorations, and I'm ready. I'm like, bring all the things this year. Bring it all. let's get the good juju going, whatever that looks like. I'm ready for Thanksgiving. I'm ready for the holidays. I'm ready for something that's a little bit different. So I want to keep that creative thinking going with Smarter News. And I never want to not ask you what you're looking for next. One of the things that you have talked about is your complete dissatisfaction with the media. Obviously, is something I identify with. That's why we started Smarter News. But I'd really love to hear from you whether it's direct message, through email, hello@smarternews.com is just an easy one to remember. Like, what do you really want to see? What is the coverage that you really need? How can the press work for you? That's what we're building. I'm not building this for a platform for myself. It's for a service. And if we aren't serving the consumer, the customer, the citizen where you are, then we will fail. And I don't want to fail. Every single executive at every media organization can do the same thing, but they choose not to. And I don't understand it, because if you're in the business of reporting, then you should talk to the people that you serve. And so I leave you with that thought today. I'd really love to hear from you, hear what you have to say, and look forward to continuing to deliver to you quick, concise, nonpartisan news on a regular basis. It's getting more difficult for me to speak. It's because I've been talking so much. I said to my husband, I said, I've talked out, I'm touched out. He's like, who are you touched out by? He's been gone. He's been on a trip. I'm like, no, wrong I said, it's just a carry through from like all the days nursing kids. It's just more of an expression. Okay, I gotta go. I got a live podcast. That's what that conversation was. Anyways, it's good. We have to laugh, guys. Great to see you. Thank you so much for your support, and look forward to seeing you again soon on smarternews.com. Have a great day. I'll talk to you later. Bye.